Despite the fact that my favorite film of all time is 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is sci-fi, and my favorite book series of all time is A Song of Ice and Fire, which is fantasy, and my favorite TV show of all time is The Twilight Zone, which is sci-fi and fantasy. Despite all of that, I was never a big Star Wars fan. And it wasn't because I was loyal to Star Trek. I couldn't get into either, honestly. But I know there is this cult-like religion of Star Wars fans out there, and I really want to understand it. I want to get into the mindset of it because it's not like I think I'm above a Star Wars fan or above someone being cultish towards a series. Because one of my closest friends, one of my filmmaking partners, for many years, at the beginning of my venture into low budget filmmaking, he's a huge Star Wars fan. He's into the lore, he's into all of that stuff. But for me, it just never clicked. So while I'm covering this original trilogy on my channel, I decided I'm going to watch some ancillary projects, and this is a documentary on the very first Star Wars film, and I'm hoping these ancillary projects that I'm watching, behind the scenes stuff, documentaries, whatever I can find, is going to help give me more context and enhance my experience of watching the movies. Now, I've never seen this before, so I'm going to be watching it for the first time with you guys. However, I'm not going to be commenting. I'm going to save all my comments for the films in my watch and react and commentary videos that I'll be dropping that you can watch along with me as I'm watching these movies. So, any comments you have, share them in the comments section. I'll reply to everyone. But just for this video, I'm just going to be watching along with you guys.
In some ways, one of the only things that was transferred from Colin Cantwell's concept model of Luke's landspeeder to actually Luke's landspeeder was almost the kind of the color temperature. But you can see that they don't have anything to do with each other. Part of the reason was that they wanted it to have a little car on the inside so we could actually drive it, whereas the concept model isn't a model that you would put a little wheel, an English three-wheel car underneath of it and drive it around in the desert. So they built that very low version of it so they could hide a little automobile in the inside of there. Also, there wasn't a good way to have a group of people in that, whereas in Luke's you could have he and Ben Kenobi and then R2-D2 on the back and C-3PO. It was like they all got jammed into the thing. In that original concept, you couldn't see the actors, and of course the actors are the big deal in the film. If you don't have them, models would just be, no one goes see a movie that just had models in it. I don't think. When you look at the Millennium Falcon, the concept model wasn't anything like it became.
The Falcon started out as the blockade runner. We finished it, photographed, sent it to England because they had a bunch of carpenters, like 300 or 400 carpenters waiting for it. And the associate producer, Jim Nelson, was like flipping out. There was a show on TV at the time in England called Space 1999. And the word was that we copied that ship. Well, I'd never seen the show, and it was coincidence that they were both long and slender, and they had an engine cluster here, and they had a cockpit up here. But that's it. And George wanted something different.
He said something, well, make the ship kind of like a hamburger, the bun and the meat in the middle, like that. And then another word that he said was something like, well, I want it like a hamburger, but how about when it actually flies, it flies like a sunfish, so it's a long, narrow thing, and that's why it had that rotating cockpit. For some reason, that idea died real quickly.
There was a mad rush. We had to get this thing done in like a few weeks so that we wouldn't keep these people waiting in England. And we had everybody in this, the camera guys dropped their work, they were making parts, and then they brought it to us and we just put stuff on it. But in a way that Joe Johnston wanted, and it had to look mechanical. And that ship was built really, really quickly and became iconic. Who would have known?
Colin Cantwell's original concept model for the Death Star, of course, is this. It's a very delicate ball, about somewhat like that, and of course it's silver, and then it has these little doodads. We made it much more mathematical, rather than arbitrary pieces here and there. We eventually knew that it ruins the scale of things to make them shiny, especially silver. It wouldn't look very good. So we definitely went to that aged off gray. It was just the most rudimentary object, those concept models. And do you know that they were used with George to go to the studios to have something visual to talk about, to say, well, there'll be an X-Wing, and it will have a fight battle with this, and this will be the Death Star, and all that kind of stuff. So to somehow convince studios that this is a reasonable idea, a reasonable project that he wants to do. For the most part, they were matte paintings. There was a matte painting of the Death Star for the first Star Wars New Hope. But there was a half sphere about this big made that we painted that gray, off-white gray color, and then scratched through and had a stage light behind it. And that particular model was so funky, and I think someone dropped it at one time. It had a crack, and we threw it in the trash. And somebody, went through our trash at nighttime, and eventually I think it's in a museum in Washington now.
The way we got into doing the holographic chess scene was there was some overflow work from England for the cantina scene. George wanted to open it up to more alien-like characters. And so while we were building this stuff, George would stop by once a week and check out the progress. And during one of his visits, he saw some stop-motion puppets that we had just sitting on a shelf. And George was like a big fan of the Ray Harryhausen movies and knew that the potential for doing this stuff, was really terrific if you could get it working. And we were like these guys that we were looking for a job that could do that kind of stuff. So George hired John Berg and myself to do this chess piece. There's a little character that bing, 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 kind of jumps in like a kangaroo, and another thing that comes up and picks it up and throws it on the ground. And the big thing was this character that I had that had a skeleton in it, and the rest are very, very simple and very rudimentary. And we probably banged them out in like 2 or 3 days, and went over to ILM, and Dennis set up the shot. And I think we shot all of the takes in just a matter of 2 days. When you're doing stop motion work, you really want to, as much as possible, be cut off from like any distractions, because you're just trying to remember momentums and moving like 20 things at the same time, and is this going forward, this going back. So you're really concentrating really hard, but in the next room right over there, they were having their rat party. So it was going on. That's, I remember we just had like, so if there are any like pops, and there was like, hey, could you guys keep it quiet?
You made a fair move. Screaming about it can't help you.
Let him have it. It's not wise to upset a Wookiee.
But, sir, nobody worries about upsetting a droid.
It's because a droid don't pull people's arms out of their sockets when they lose. Wookiees are known to do that.
I see your point, sir. I suggest a new strategy, R2. Let the Wookiee win.
In Colin Cantwell's original concept model, of course, it has the long nose, just like the real X-Wing had. But we were also amused that the body of that is actually a dragster body. That's what makes that long nose, His models were kind of lightweight, not as swarthy, not as strong-looking. So we took some of the ideas, which I think was originally Ralph McQuarrie's idea. He had a small X-Wing in a painting. And George had this idea of a used universe. I remember the idea came down from him, and he didn't want anything too slick or too well painted, or it also needed to look aged, and also boilerplate technology. Everything had to look like it had been riveted together, assembled, rather than just a slick mono shape. And that was one of the guiding principles for our models. Yeah, we changed quite a bit from the concepts for the X-Wing. And one of the reasons was to make it look stronger, but also it had to contain motors for the ship to go into an X. Our X-Wing was probably about that long from nose to tail, and we carved it out of wood, a wooden pattern. We didn't always do that, but that particular case we did. But then it also had a lot of tank parts, and all along the backside where the engine is and the back end and that kind of thing it was really well and completely detailed. But the X-Wing, became a very, very important model. There's probably more shots of close-ups and actors in X-Wings because they could have some personality. Darth Vader had personality, we could call it that, but all the pilots that were with him, they were just dark shapes, But so there was a lot of emphasis on the X-Wings.
They could use a good pilot like you. You're turning your back on them.
What good's the reward if you ain't around to use it? Besides, attacking that battle station ain't my idea of courage. It's more like suicide.
The Y-Wing was featured in some of Ralph McQuarrie's early concept illustrations. Kind of harkens back to the P-38, the two fuselage fighter plane of World War II. Colin Cantwell did the concepts to get the idea across of the basic look and feel of all the different fighters and ships. I think the Y-Wing particularly is an interesting idea, an interesting ship. It reminded me a little bit of a 57 Thunderbird. It had kind of a sleekness to it. As we worked on it and added details to it, it took on more of a kind of a cobbled together hot rod look. We had a lot of freedom in interpreting the concept models, and a lot of the time the direction that they took was determined more by the kind of parts that we could find to build them. Like I remember the front of the rocket engine was actually a legs container. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but that was a plastic container for hose that we could just get at a drugstore. All the smaller fighter models had to be produced and molded to make molded in foam to make explosion versions of them. That's a bit more difficult and time-consuming to make sure that every detail that's put on there could be pulled out of a mold. One of my most memorable moments of making the models in Star Wars was one day we stretched a wire from the warehouse to a tree that was in the parking lot, and we attached a Y-wing to that wire and put a rocket motor in one of the rocket sides and ignited it, and it took off and flew across the parking lot in about a half a second, and it was with smoke trailing behind it, and it was curving, and it was better than anything that ended up in the film. It was really exciting, and it hit the tree and just exploded into 100 pieces, and it was really a fun moment.
Here they come.
The concept for the TIE fighter is much more spindly. You can see that little round shape has no real detail on it, just a little ball, and the rods and the wings are very lightweight and thin. In some ways it's more like a glider compared to a fighter pilot plane, that kind of thing. And we definitely had to head that direction with it. It needed to look not like a lightweight pleasure ship, but a heavyweight battleship. The final TIE fighters also changed radically for color. The bad guys all had this kind of a dark military blue battleship color, and the good guys were a little bit lighter value. We certainly did, on the TIE fighter, we did kit bashing, but there's so many shapes. The multi-spoke thing on the wheel, the ball that isn't totally a ball that goes off into a more of a hexagonal side pieces, all of those had to be carved individually. They weren't kit bashed. The kit bashing part of it is the tiny little details. And, we knew that since you had a key light, all of the sun, it would create all these little hard shapes, hard little lines and everything on the shadows. They do have a certain amount of bashed kits in there, but the bulk of it is carved in wood or plastic and then molded.
Stay in attack formation.
At the very beginning, there wasn't, we didn't think like there'll be a special TIE fighter for Darth Vader. But They knew they set them out in space and they're flying around. Well, who's who? What do you put a big sign on it that says this is Darth Vader's ship, or how do you do that? Because even when you go in for a close-up on the face, and then when you go to a far-away shot, if all the TIE fighters are exactly the same, which one is he? You can definitely tell Darth Vader's ship because it doesn't have those big, long wings up the side. It's more condensed. The cockpit is exactly the same, or at least almost exactly the same. But the wings were just made different, so you definitely knew which ship Darth Vader was in when it appeared on the screen. Curiously enough, there was even a drawing that was called a double cockpit TIE fighter that was similar to Darth's. And we nicknamed that the double chili tie because there was a place you could get chili dogs near where we worked. And, you could get a double chili tie, too, which is more chili on top of the hot dogs. And it was probably left over from George saying, well, let's make the Millennium Falcon like a hamburger, So now we had a chili dog model, too. We're doing the Death Star surface, the laser tower that was a part of the concept art that Joe Johnston and Ralph McQuarrie were doing. We created them in a couple of different sizes, the small size and the bigger size. But when you want to do a close-up, you can't close in on a model that's this big and have it fill up the full screen. And that's when we build the big model, you get in close to that laser tower. And I think Paul Houston was the one who did that particular model.
I worked on the storyboards for the initial bidding phase of the Star Wars effects. So I had drawn a lot of different cannons and trenches and the ships and stuff like that. So I had an idea in my mind of what it should look like. We didn't use a lot of reference for building these things. It was, I think most of the model makers for Star Wars considered that there's a kind of a mechanical aesthetic that we all appreciated and tried to put into the models, that a certain arrangement of exhaust pipes looked cool. A large barrel with cooling rods and ammo packets can just be arranged in a way that sculpturally and aesthetically looks interesting and fun. This shot was the first shot that was completed by ILM. We printed out a big picture and framed it, and everybody signed it and gave it to George, and it said, at the bottom it said, "Our first shot." That was at the point where we'd spent some millions of dollars to get the visual effects facility up and running. It was kind of an exciting first moment.
The original design for the walkers came from a piece of artwork that Sid Mead had done. That was an ad for a big corporation.
Joe talked to him about basing his design on Sid Mead's work, and Sid was fine with that. It wasn't a direct copy, it was just inspiration.
I saw some of the early designs for it, and originally it was always the four legs, but it didn't originally have the head on it, and the legs were farther apart, and it just was kind of this bulky sort of thing. And at some point in there, it became more dog-like. And so you could relate to it subconsciously. It sort of had a head, which is where the control guys kind of were, which makes no sense. Why weren't they in the actual thing? It didn't have a tail. They couldn't figure out how to give it a tail on it. But it had the four legs that were put together, tighter so the hips weren't as wide apart. And you could really recognize it then and kind of relate to it. And it was just a great design. We made a number of them about this big, this tall, like that just big enough for the hands of the animator to hold the legs and the forearms back and the head to be able to animate it. And then we made a bigger one, probably 4 feet tall, for a few shots when it has to collapse.
And they had electric clutches in the joints so they could trigger the legs to collapse on cue. Well, the thing got to be so heavy, and I had built the body for it, and it was pretty heavy. The electric clutches just wouldn't hold up and fire on cue. So we ended up hanging the guy from a rope, released a rope and pulled him down with the smaller cable. He had little explosions going on throughout the body work, and it just looked great. It had tremendous mass. The way it fell, you believed it was 100 tons.
right, stand by, Dak.
Well, the rebels used the speeder to take down the snow walkers, the giant AT-ATs. And what they would do is fly around the legs, ejecting a cable so they could tie up the legs and trip the walkers. So we built several. One was a pyro model that would crash into the snow and blow up. It was a very small model, maybe a foot long, and to make it look like a 20-foot long aircraft was a real trick. And my role was to animate the air brakes, the flaps on the back. As the animated flaps would move, of course, the ship would bank and turn. We animated the pilots so they would, look around, look where they're flying. The day we did the pyro shot, it was on the old D building on Kerner. Well, it was such an impressive shot. After doing a few tests, everybody knew this was going to be spectacular. The entire company was on a balcony overlooking the stage, and our manager came in and looked around and said, "Oh my God, this is costing me $1,000 a minute to have all these people watching." I mean, there was literally nobody working. Everybody was waiting for that shot. It was hysterical.
The Tauntauns and the Walkers were the two first things that got the stop motion department up and running on Empire, making replicas of things that you could not produce any other way, and making articulated models of strange creatures, putting them in photographic backgrounds, and trying as hard as you could to make it appear as though those performances that were shot one frame at a time had the same mass and weight and lighting effects as the photographic backgrounds that your live characters are in. George wanted to see some designs for this creature that was essentially a horse, and I think it was characterized as a snow lizard. So I just did a whole bunch of 8 or 10 drawings, and then I did like a little clay maquette of one of the drawings with a little rider on the back of it, which was my best guess. We brought that up to George, and he said, "Well, this looks like a good one." And that was the idea. It was just a thing that got people from A to B that just helped kind of flesh out the reality of the snow landscape of Hoth. If you have a shot that requires the tauntaun to take a breath, fall down, do a death rattle, and a final breath, each of these moments are like you just scale them. So it's like a 4-second shot. And something like that could easily take, 6 to 8 hours to shoot, because you got to make sure that you're trying to register everything very carefully, and you can't kick any of the lights. If you kick any of the lights, then you have to start the shot over. And so you just go through it one frame at a time, and they're literally sculpting in space and time. There were only a couple of tauntaun shots, I think, that we did multiple takes on. And most of that was because I was just pleading with George and Dennis, "Come on, let me do another take. Please, 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 let me just do one more." And they go, "Okay, fine, but only one more."
Up until the Rebel transport, most of the ships that we'd done had a lot of flat surfaces. They were concerned that a curved surface would be difficult to photograph on the blue screen because of blue spill. The flat surface ships turned out to be maybe a little overly conservative, and as long as the surface of the ship was matte, the blue spill didn't really turn out to be much of a problem regardless of the shape. It was also influenced by some of the curving, more organic ships and artwork by Mobius around that time, Jean Giraud. And it was a little bit of an homage to his kind of sense of humor, making a big spaceship look like a clam. When you live with a model for months and think about it and imagine it in so many different ways, it's almost always disappointing to see it on screen, because in your imagination it lives 360 degrees from a lot of different views, and you imagine it in different lighting. And the most enjoyable thing is just to become engrossed in creating something rather than just piling on irrelevant details. That model had so much details, particularly on the underside of it with all the containers and things that don't really show up on the screen. If they have lots and lots of detail that are not random and not repetitious, that have little pieces that are meaningful, as soon as you see something like that and you identify it in your mind, then it gives you a feeling of scale.
I am wondering, why are you here?
I'm looking for someone.
Looking? Found someone you have, I would say.
Right.
One of the earlier things I did is I got Joe Johnston to work on Yoda to try to figure out, what he would look like so it'd be easier to write him. That really comes from a tradition in mythological storytelling, fairy tales, of the hero finding a little creature on the side of the road that seems very insignificant and not very important, who comes out to be the master wizard, the master thing, or the guide, the main guide in the movie for the hero. And so I wanted him to be a little insignificant character, somebody that, like a frog or something that you just didn't pay any attention to. And he turns out to be the most powerful Jedi in the universe. And so that was why he started out being very small and green. And then we wanted to make him attractive but strange. And so he's actually got proportions very much like a baby, and with giant ears.
Frank Oz and his associates have come up with different heads. None of them work. So Stuart Freeborn, the makeup expert, he said, "Can you give me a week? I'll give you the head of Yoda."
He showed me a few drawings and things he had with him, and I looked at them. And I thought, well, that's interesting there and there, but I want something in more depth. I looked in the mirror, and I thought, well, something perhaps a little bit amusing about my face. At least I could get that in. So I modelled something of myself. And I thought, now I've got to make him look intelligent. And I got this photograph of Einstein, and on top of what I'd roughly done of myself, I then put the Einstein wrinkles in all around.
And here was his head. And I looked at him, and I looked at Yoda, and I realized what everybody was realizing and couldn't say. It was a self-portrait of Stuart Freeborn.
I'm not afraid.
Oh, you will be. You will be.
Sorry. No problems.
In the original of the Star Destroyer, Ralph McQuarrie was the one that did this little triangular thing, maybe about 1.5 inches long, that was in one drawing, incidentally. And George really liked that idea. And then he hired a model maker. This was before there ever was an ILM, that they made these concept models. Ours became more swarthy, more aggressive looking kind of a ship, as opposed to this more delicate kind of space station-y looking ship.
We see the White Star Destroyer in the beginning of Episode 4, and then in Episode 5 we see the big White Star Destroyer again when the rebels escape from Hoth and the Empire is in pursuit of them. It was really fun to build because it was a larger version of the 3-foot Star Destroyer, so a lot of the uncertainties about what it was, like the proportions of it and the shape and all that stuff, was pretty well nailed down.
One of the things that was very important was to try and transmit to people what the scale of the thing really was, how big it was. And we knew that the way that when you fly over a city, you tell the difference between flying over Poughkeepsie, Illinois and Los Angeles is by how many lights there are. And so that's what we had, our guide was, and we put tens of thousands of fiber optics in that particular ship. And fiber optics allow you to have this little tiny little pinpoint of light. We had a light source on the inside of it, was a projection lamp, and then it went out to travel down all of these fiber optics to different pinpoints on the ship.
There was a tungsten halogen bulbs that were inside the ship, which are very hot and require cooling, and there was a compressed air system to cool those off. It was like a little miniature nuclear reactor out there on the stage.
We tried to transmit scale to people on all the ships. It's like big ships have hundreds of thousands of lights, little ships have 1 or 2 or 3 or 5, you know. So right from the beginning you'd say, this is really a big ship because it has lots of lights on it. With Darth Vader's Star Destroyer, the original idea was to save money, was to just take the regular white Star Destroyer and paint it blue. Well, from a model maker's point of view, the problem with that is it had tens of thousands of little fiber optics that we would have to scrape to get the lights exposed. And also we knew that, just because they tell you that they're through shooting the white Star Destroyer, it doesn't mean they really are. So on one side there was production, said we want to keep the budget low, and on the other side there was the model shop that knew that that wouldn't save time, which would then affect the budget. So we appealed to them to make it a totally different ship. And that's when Joe Johnston started drawing that really long, narrow arrow is really what it looks like. George really liked the idea, you know, that it really looked different. And probably the only problem is that then production said, but it has to be done in 7 weeks, because we shoot in 7 weeks. Yes, we were going to make this whole new Darth Vader ship, which was called eventually the Executor, but to make it be really huge, we needed to have more lights. So if the 8-foot white Star Destroyer had about 100,000 lights, Darth Vader's ship then, since it was so much bigger, had to have many more lights. We couldn't use fiber optics because we were already reaching the max at around 100,000 fiber optics, and you can only fit, you know, your human hands can only do so many little things in the period of time we had. So what we did was, I think it was Paul Houston came up with the idea of doing artwork and then etching into brass these little tiny holes. And so we could draw up one panel, like something like this, reduce it down, count how many lights would be per inch, and we eventually came up with around 250,000 lights. So you just knew that, this is really, really big. Both with that ship and the white Star Destroyer, it became like a quilting bee. So they were big, and people would sit around and they'd work on this section. And then I'd say every 4 hours or something, I'd say, well, move 2 feet, you know, and have somebody else rotate so that you wouldn't get one person's style that would dominate only in one area, and then somebody else's style that would develop in another area. But we worked 7 days a week for about 7 weeks to do that. Me and Paul, our eyes were, you know, by the time 7 weeks happened, our eyes were just like hanging down like this, and pallor, you know, gray pallor, and we took off to Mexico for a week right away.
Empire was originally released in 70 millimeter, and after seeing it a few times, George decided that the ending wasn't real clear. So he asked us to build a new, larger scale section of the medical frigate. We re-shot that sequence when the film was eventually released in 35 millimeter. Apparently nobody knew that it had a new ending that was really different from the first one. It explained the relationship between the Falcon and the frigate. With all those models, George wanted everything to look aged. That, you know, this was a rebel group, not the Empire, so they didn't have brand new equipment. So everything was scavenged from junkyards and made to work. So we did essentially the same thing. We did miniature bits and pieces, you know, found objects like the model kits. The saving grace for all those models is that really trick paint job that Joe developed for us. Essentially dirty white with a lot of stains and bullet hits and that sort of thing. And it would have had fiber optic lighting tricks in it, and a rear projection screen for the little window where our heroes are standing. Time was the big challenge. Everything was in a hurry, so we were working between 10 and 18-hour days, and in the case of the second frigate, it was 24 hours a day for, I believe it was 2 days. And then George said, he did that so quickly, why did it take so long to do the rest of them?
The Cloud cars, 2 of them intercept the Falcon as it's approaching Cloud City. And that's when we first see them, and then we notice that there's 2 pilots separated by the engine.
It's fairly sleek and doesn't have as much the mechanical detail that a lot of the other ships had, and I guess that's the aesthetic of the Cloud City, is that it's more Art Deco and more refined. This model was also inspired a little bit by John Giroux and Mobius and his kind of whimsical sense of vehicles in a science fiction setting. It was also one of the, in Empire Strikes Back, getting more into forms that are curved and have compound curves rather than the flat shapes of Episode 4.
I did a lot of surface detailing and painting of it. It was a orange paint job. That's what they wanted, so kind of distinctive in a blue sky. We'd give it little details here and there to show scale. That was always an important thing to include in a model, particularly next to a human. You could always figure out how big it was based on what a human looked like next to it.
The difficult thing about the Cloud Car was that at that time and that kind of technology, and not making molds and casting parts, but just using vacuum formed plastic parts, that it was a little bit tricky to make the seam in the center of it line up and not be visually too powerful.
And of course, you never know what these things sound like till Ben Burtt puts his sound magic to it, and it's pretty neat.
Permission granted to land on platform 327.
Thank you.
I don't even think I saw the drawings for Cloud City till we were already well into Empire. Then it was brought up, Joe Johnston was like, well, we got to do this. We got to do this kind of a model. And at the time, I had interviewed lots of different model makers. I was interviewing, sometimes 1 and 2 a day kind of thing, trying to find people. It was hard to find sometimes. There was this one sculptor that I had interviewed, and models that he actually did as sculptures looked very much like Cloud City. And so I thought, oh, wow, how perfect this would be. The guy was named Mark Thorpe. He had his sculptures that he would bring in and show us, and everybody went, oh, yeah, I could make one like this. I'll make one that's a little bit different. I'll make one like this. So in some ways, like a quilting bee. We sent people to their desk all to build kind of a similar theme model, but each one would be different. But then they were all brought together and put on tables and shot that way.
The Rancor monster was George coming in and saying, hey, we need a big monster for this pit scene. My idea was like a cross between a bear and a potato. George said he wanted it to be a man in a suit. We're going to do the best man in the suit ever. George insisted that we create animatics, or today they're called like previs. And I got in this Rancor suit and I played Rancor. And ultimately, it didn't look that good or that dynamic. And George said, forget this. So it was Dennis's idea to shoot all of the Rancor pit scene as a puppet, shooting at a very highly advanced frame rate. So I designed this Rancor as a kind of a cross between a rod puppet. There were rods that would allow the feet to walk. There were rods that came up the arms, allowed the arms to twist and hands to open that were operated by another operator. And then I would drive the head of the thing. There was a hole in the back, and I could put my hand in its mouth, and we had goo dripping from it. But the problem with performing any kind of nuanced performance is that you're actually performing it at 3 times the speed. So you got to get your brain into this space where it's like, okay, you rehearse it. So the door opens and Rancor and sees Luke and roars. And so that's how it's going to play on film. But when you actually shoot it, it's like there's a camera there, and Dennis yells, action, and the camera operator turns the camera on, and the camera goes, and starts like the film just starts going through the gate and go action, and then you go like, okay, great, that was it. And did we get it? I mean, who knows? We don't know until. And so we shot tons and tons and tons of takes on some of this stuff. You know, some days we would go in, there would be some shots that was like 70 takes. We just shot so much stuff and tried to do like different stuff that you just don't know until you take a look at it. That little character was just kind of a cast-off, and it was just a little hand puppety thing that Tony McVeigh just did as a background piece. George asked us to come up with a name for the thing, and we went out to lunch, and we had a couple of pitchers of beer, and we were trying to come up with a name, and we couldn't think of it, and we were getting up to go, and my tennis shoes had come undone. And I said, hey, wait a minute, guys, let's stop and wait for a minute while I, under the influence of a couple pints of beer, tie my shoelaces. And what? That's a great name for that guy. And so we pitched that to George and told him the story, and he said, no, it ain't going to be that. And then he came up with salacious, so he turned the shoelacious into salacious. But he was just like this guy that was just kind of, anointed by George. He's going to be, Jabba's little pet. And that's how that came about.
It was a slave costume. It was supposed to be skimpy. The reason it was a costume like that is George said, we want to show that Princess Leia is growing up. So those 3 episodes spanned a certain amount of time. So she got more mature, and that's why the slave costume was introduced. And the fans also were getting more mature, supposedly, and 15 or 20 years later, a lot of people would come up to me and say, you made the Princess Leia costume. Wow, that was the best thing I ever saw when I was a kid. I had a sculpture of my own style that I had developed. I took one of these to show to the art director, Nilo Rodas, and immediately he felt like I had a handle on something. When I did show George the finished costume, he's looking at it and looking at it and looking at it, and he turns around and walks away. And the art director goes with him. And I thought, well, that's the end of that one, I guess he really hated it. But in about 5 minutes, the art director came back and he said, he loves it, he loves it. And I said, but he didn't say anything. He said, well, that's why we know he loves it. Eventually, we cast it in the flimsy or soft material, so that when she wore it, it would flex. However, she still didn't like it. I don't blame her, because wearing something like this, I did put leather on the back of it to help it feel better. The problem was, I made the costume according to her proportions before the movie. Then they went off to shoot the film in England. A month or 2 later, they came back, and then they were going to put the costume on her. And when that happened, she must have lost 10 pounds, if not more. So the costume really hung on her. Most people probably didn't notice it, but I noticed it, and that's what happens when you have things that stay around for a very long time.
Come on, we gotta get out of here quick.
The design for Jabba was the part of a competition. It wasn't a competition either. It was like Joe and Nilo and Ralph and I would come up with a bunch of different ideas. And so George picked this big kind of wormy snake-like thing that went to Stuart Freeborn, and all of his guys built that in England. So it was a big full-scale puppet. One guy did this arm, and another guy did that arm, and another guy I did the head and the mouth, and then I think there was a breathing bladder, and then one of the little people was in the tail and would make the tail move. The eyes were done with radio control, blinking and looking around. So it was quite a thing. I mean, one of the problems with all of that stuff and all of the shooting and all of the puppeteering is like what happens when the ADs are having the puppeteers line the puppets up to get a shot, and so the camera operators can find the framing and all that. The puppeteer has to hold the thing up, and so it can be a while, that your arm's up there, and invariably what would happen is you get like a camera line up, and it was like, come on, let's just shoot this shot. But it's like, by that time, all the blood is like drained out of the performer's hand, and he's like totally numb. And it's like, oh God. So some of the things were, make it do, it was like, I can't even feel my hand. So that was like one of the things that was always coming up. I think it was, David, was one of the great first ADs of all time, got like relatively quickly into the thing and would really make sure that the puppeteers didn't die, before they had to do their work.
The Chicken Walker, which made a brief appearance at Empire Strikes Back, was so successful that it showed up again in Jedi in a lot of shots, and that was essentially the same way as we'd done them before. Stop motion puppet about this big, animated one frame at a time, pretty much always shot against blue screen, except a few times where we needed a bigger one for the sort of shots where it was interacting and being destroyed or something like that. But most of the time it was stop motion.
Between Empire and Jedi, we developed this system called Go Motion. That was all XYZ, stepper motors and slides that were run by computers that added motion blur to the stop motion. It became very clear that it upped the ante of believability for this kind of thing. You didn't get the same staccato kind of jerkiness that sometimes comes along with stop motion. In some ways, it was a precursor to digital animation, in that when you're animating a three-dimensional character on a set, you are in some ways sculpting in time. You're actually physically touching things, and you're moving from pose to pose and frame to frame, and you're moving everything along in your mind. The Go Motion stuff was very different. You had to like totally explode your brain and understand all the movement in terms of these axes that they were on. So it was a much more analytical kind of approach that you couldn't be that analytical about. The most complicated shot on Jedi was this shot where the Ewoks are winning the day, and they chop some logs, and the logs come rolling down the hill, and they run into this walker, and they destabilize it, and the walkers are like on these logs, and it falls over. And the Go Motion part of that, I think, took me the better part of like a month or something like that, just to figure out how to make all that pantomime work, because it was just unbelievably, ridiculously complicated and took a really long time to do, but it worked.
Very often on the Star Wars films, they would do maybe a half dozen different designs, and then George would usually pick one. But the one that was chosen for the Tidarium shuttle, I really liked because it reminded me of Luke's Y-Wing, or Luke's Skyhopper, which was the original Y-Wing. I don't know if a lot of people know that, but if you look at it, of course, it's like an upside-down Y. And that kind of triangular wing configuration of the shuttle Tidarium was very reminiscent of that ship. The shuttle Tidarium model was used in all the shots you see. There was a little panel piece or something on the nose that made it Darth Vader's. I can't remember all the details, but it was just to differentiate it from because there are a few of them you see in the film, and that was used for all the shots. A couple of exceptions are there's a shot where it is leaving the fleet and it goes off into hyperspace, and even though the model is only about 2.5, 3 feet tall, that was still too big to get that hyperspace effect. So a much smaller version was built just for that shot. It was a really complex model. It had landing gear that extended. The wings, of course, folded up for when it landed. And although it was engineered incredibly well, we had to make the wings very, very light because the motors could only torque so much and move so much weight. And I was charged with building the wings. So I built them out of a very, very thin styrene, which was great, except if you ever go to an exhibit and see the model now, you notice that the wings are a little bit warped. And the reason for that is because they couldn't be built super sturdy. They had to be very, very light.